Welcome to the Wine Lab. I'm your host, Andreea Botezatu, and today we are talking about smoke taint. This is one of those wine topics that sounds almost poetic at first. Smoke, fire, vineyards under dramatic skies, a glass of wine carrying the memory of a landscape. It sounds cinematic, until you realize what it actually means for the people growing the grapes, making the wine, and buying the bottle. Because smoke taint is not romance. It is loss and uncertainty. It is a vineyard looking beautiful from the outside, while something invisible has already settled onto the fruit. It is a wine that may smell normal at first, then finish with a taste of ashes. And it has become part of a much larger story, one that reaches well beyond wine. Over the last several years, consumers have become used to seeing wildfire images that once felt exceptional. Orange skies over cities, fire maps expanding across entire regions, harvest seasons shaped by smoke forecasts. California has become one of the best-known examples, and Australia has lived through this reality as well, especially during severe bushfire season. These are places where wine is deeply tied to landscape, and where that landscape is increasingly stressed by heat, drought, and fire weather. Climate change is increasing wildfire risk in many regions by contributing to hotter conditions, worsening drought in some places, and creating the kind of environment that dries vegetation and helps fires spread more easily. In places like California and parts of Australia, longer fire seasons, more frequent heat extremes, and more severe fire weather have made smoke exposure a growing concern for grape growers and winemakers. For wine lovers, California and Australia matter because they are not minor corners of the wine world. They are major influential producers with famous regions, strong domestic wine cultures, and long-standing global reputations. When wildfire smoke affects vineyards there, this is not an obscure agricultural footnote. It becomes a consumer story. It changes which wines reach the market, how they taste, how much they cost, and how much risk growers and wineries are carrying from one season to the next. California and Australia are the best-known examples, but they are far from alone. Smoke exposure has also become a concern in other wine regions shaped by wildfire, including Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and parts of South Africa. So, how does smoke from a fire end up affecting grapes that may be miles away from the flames? The first thing to understand is that smoke travels. It does not stay parked over the fire that created it. Wildfire smoke can move hundreds or even thousands of miles depending on atmospheric conditions. Some of the visible plume may thin out with distance, but tiny particles and gases can continue moving through the atmosphere long after the fire itself feels remote. A vineyard does not need to be burning to be at risk. It needs to be in the path of the smoke. Then comes the part that matters for the grapes. Smoke is a complicated mixture, but for wine, the key compounds are a group called volatile phenols, formed when wood burns. These compounds are carried in smoke and can come into contact with grape berries and vine tissues. They can move into exposed grape tissues and later be transformed inside the fruit. Once inside the berries, many of these compounds become bound to sugars. Those bound forms may not smell strongly smoky on their own, which is one reason the fruit can seem deceptively fine at first. Later, during fermentation, aging, or even while the wine is in your mouth, some of those compounds can be released and become part of the aroma and flavor you actually perceive. This is the part many consumers find most surprising. Smoke taint is not simply soot on the outside of the grape. It's not a dust problem that can be rinsed away and forgotten. The chemistry moves into the fruit. That is why the problem can be so frustrating. A vineyard may look intact, the clusters may look healthy, harvest may continue, and yet the wine can still develop smoky, burnt, ashy, medicinal, or cold fireplace-like characters later on. If you are a consumer, the sensory part is where this becomes very real. People often imagine smoke taint as a strong bonfire aroma the moment they lift the glass. Sometimes it does present that way, but often the more revealing moment comes later. You taste the wine, it may seem acceptable at first. Then the finish arrives, and suddenly there is ash, char, or an unpleasant smoky bitterness lingering in the mouth. The ashy aftertaste is one of the most recognizable signs. That lingering finish is a big part of why smoke-tainted wines can feel so disappointing. They can start with promise and end with a reminder of the fire. And there is something almost cruel in that contrast because smoke in other foods can be deeply appealing. We love smoke in barbecue. We celebrate it in peated whiskey. We seek it out in roasted coffee, lapsang sujong tea, smoked cheeses, grilled vegetables, charred bread, mezcal. Smoke in the right place can signal warmth, craftsmanship, and pleasure. In a wildfire-affected wine, though, the sensory effect is different. It feels displaced. It feels like damage, not intention. There is also a human story behind this chemistry. Imagine a grower in California, after weeks of heat, checking fire maps instead of weather maps. Imagine a winery in South Africa trying to decide whether to pick, test, make a small trial fermentation, or walk away from fruit that otherwise looks beautiful. Imagine consumers who know nothing about any of this, buying a bottle months later and wondering why the wine tastes oddly ashy, flat, or dirty. That is one of the hard things about smoke taint. The fire may be over, but the consequences can show up much later, in a much more insidious form, in the glass itself. From a climate perspective, wine is a very vivid messenger because it translates environmental stress into something sensory. People may tune out charts, projections, and policy language, but they understand a bottle of wine that no longer tastes the way it should. They understand a harvest cut short. They understand the image of vineyards under smoke-darkened skies. Smoke taint sits inside that broader pattern. It is one of the ways climate pressure enters everyday life through food and drink. Of course, not every smoky year produces ruined wine, and not every exposed vineyard will create the same outcome. Risk depends on the intensity and duration of smoke exposure, the freshness of the smoke, grape variety, timing, and winemaking decisions. Repeated or heavy fresh smoke exposure tends to be more concerning. The exact level of exposure needed to produce perceptible smoke character is still not perfectly defined because smoke composition changes quickly in the atmosphere, and different grapes and wines respond differently. That uncertainty is one reason growers and wineries rely on lab testing and small fermentations rather than guesswork alone. Consumers sometimes ask whether this means all wines from a wildfire year should be avoided. No. That would be far too simple and often unfair. Some wines are unaffected. Some are carefully screened. Some styles are less vulnerable than others because skin contact matters, and red wines are often at greater risk than whites due to greater extraction from the skins. Press fractions can also intensify the issue, which is why wineries may separate free-run and press wine very carefully in smoky vintages. The key point is that smoke taint is a real risk, not an automatic sentence for every wine from an affected region. Still, the emotional weight of it is worth pausing on. Wine is one of the most place-driven products we make. We celebrate that constantly. We talk about terroir, vintage, site, season, sunlight, rain, and regional character. We love the idea that a wine tastes like where it came from. Smoke taint forces a darker version of that same idea. Sometimes the place leaves a scar instead of a signature. And that may be why this topic resonates so strongly with consumers. It is scientific, yes. It is agricultural, certainly, but it is also intimate. A wildfire is a landscape event. Smoke taint is that event made personal, poured into a glass, and tasted at the dinner table. So, what should you remember if you are simply someone who loves wine and wants to understand the issue better? First, smoke taint is linked to wildfire smoke exposure of grapes, especially through volatile phenols that can be absorbed and later released in the wine. Second, smoke can travel long distances, so vineyards do not need to sit next to the flames to be affected. Third, the classic signs are smoky, burnt, ashy medicinal notes, often with a very persistent ash-like finish. And fourth, this is part of a larger climate story playing out very visibly in places like California and Australia, where hotter conditions and more extreme fire weather are increasing the stakes for the wine world. The next time you hear about a fire season in wine country, you will know that the story does not end when the flames are contained. Smoke can drift, it can settle, it can enter fruit, and it can wait. And months later, in a bottle opened far from the fire itself, it can still speak. If you enjoy this episode, buy a bottle, taste attentively, share it with someone curious, and pay attention to how a wine's finish can reveal as much as its aroma. And if you have feedback, questions, or ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. My email address can be found on the podcast website page. Until next time, this is your host, Andreea Botezatu, and this has been The Wine Lab. Stay curious. Cheers.